Wednesday night. This is a two-parter, one on a Wednesday night, one on a Sunday morning. So the review isn't from last Sunday, it's from last Wednesday. And just a short review, because we got a lot to cover this morning, and we will cover it in plenty of time. Ezekiel 38, verse 2 and verses 5 and 6. Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. You say, who in the world is Ezekiel going to prophesy against? If you haven't followed Bible prophecy much, you don't know who Gog is, who Magog is, who the prince of Meshech and Tubal is, but we give you some hints here. Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown, a commentary, said this, where it said the prince of Meshech and Tubal. In the Septuagint, it's rendered the prince of Wrath. Now, how many of you know what the Septuagint is? All right, you're going to find out. The Old Testament was written in the language of the Jews, Hebrew. Moses wrote the first 5 books because God, he participated in the last 3.5 of those books, which was God working through him to give Israel the law. But he was not around for any of Genesis, so everything he wrote about Genesis was given to him by the Holy Spirit and possibly confirmed by stories that were handed down. We don't know exactly how that worked. But he wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And then of course, by the end of Deuteronomy, you have a Jewish nation having spent 40 years in the wilderness, ready to go into the promised land. At the end of Deuteronomy, Moses is being taken up in a mountain to see the promised land. He doesn't get to go because he disobeyed God about not smiting the rock. And so the next book he didn't write was named Joshua. And Joshua was the book where we learn about how God took Israel into the promised land that he promised Abraham. And ever since then, after Joshua, there's always a nation of Israel, and throughout the Old Testament. And so anyway, all that Old Testament written in Hebrew, after Alexander the Great, the emperor of Greece, the young guy, conquered the whole then known world by the time he was 30. Ambitious guy with his military. He conquered the entire world that he knew about by the time he was 30. But I'm still more blessed than he was. I made 35. Alexander the Great died a very young man. And he died a lot richer, but I've lived a lot longer. So, live a short life rich, a longer life not so rich. I don't know. I think I'd choose the second. But anyway, when Alexander conquered the whole then known world, he was a Greek. So he mandated that all of his subjects learn a simple form of Greek, so his soldiers could communicate with them wherever they went. So whatever was their native tongue, they had to add to that native tongue a second tongue. They had to learn some Greek. When the Romans overthrew the Greeks, they didn't reinvent the wheel. Their soldiers could already communicate with all their subjects because those soldiers had to learn and had it handed down to them simple Greek as well. Some commentaries use the phrase street Greek. But nonetheless, by the time the New Testament comes along, everyone in the known world speaks Greek. So the New Testament was written in the universal language of Greek. So Old Testament written in Hebrew, New Testament written in Greek. Well, as time went on, scholars translated the Old Testament written in Hebrew into Greek, so more people who read could read it and study it. That translation from Hebrew to Greek is called the Septuagint. That's the name of that work. And so when this scholar, this commentary, Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown says, in parentheses there, the Septuagint, he's saying that when they translated the Hebrew into Greek, instead of doing what the King James has done and says the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, they said rather the prince of Ross. And so that's what that's all about. Now, the Scythian, Taurian, and the Crimea were so called. The Iraq says these are old country, old peoples. Also was called Ross. The modern Russians may have hence assumed their name as Moscow and Tobolsk from Meshech and Tubal, though their proper ancient name was Slavia or Wends. So he's saying that this was an ancient country that is being prophesied against, that today that territory is called Russia. All right? So, verse 5, besides prophesying against Russia, he goes on, here's who else you have to prophesy against, Ezekiel. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Now Persia, that's Iran, and it includes the land of Iraq. Again, I mentioned Wednesday night, I hate when I read that, I hate that because a lot of soldiers, American soldiers, died in Iraq trying to bring freedom to that part of the world. But when you've never known freedom, you tend to gravitate to your comfort zone. And so Iraq still isn't, they have elections and stuff, but the bottom line is the different ministers from different sects of Islam are still fighting each other for dominion. And it appears one of two things is true. When Russia invades Israel, Iran's going to be with them, and possibly Iraq. Or it could simply be, because this is, Jack, I was thinking about what I said Wednesday night about Germany. There could be another explanation. Just because that land was part of Iraq and Iran today, just doesn't mean the whole bunch of it has to rebel. Just a part of it. So it could be just Iran. I certainly hope so. Do not know, do not have a clue if Iraq will be involved in this alliance. But we know Iran will be. Gomer, not Pyle. It's not Gomer Pyle. Although Gomer is a good singer, so he might have had a band. I don't know. But Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters and all his bands, and many people with thee. You could call that a war of the bands. I don't know why you would, but you could. Gomer is Germany, including the boundaries of Poland. Togarmah, in today's world, that land is Armenia and East Russia. So again, with Germany, it's possible that of that landmass that today is inhabited by Germans and a little bit of Poland, maybe it's the Poland part that's going to rebel and join Russia in this fight against Israel. So I don't know, because when I see Germany on this list, I think I can't imagine Germany. They did break ranks and buy their gas from Russia, where the other countries in the EU aren't doing that. But it's just hard for me to see one of those European countries, because they're more apt to be in the next thing that happens, the Antichrist kingdom, than they are in this. So anyway, could be Poland and Iran, along with, Poland, and Iran, along with Russia and a few other satellite countries that practice Islam. When you practice Islam, you want to kill the Jews. Now, not here in America so much. I believe there are a lot of peace-loving Muslims here in America. I'm going to tell you something. If you grow up here, your parents brought you here, and you grow up here in the land of the free, the last thing you want is for Sharia law to come and put things over your face and take the woman's rights away. So I believe that there are a lot of westernized Muslims in America that do not want to practice Sharia law. And they don't hate everybody and want to blow everybody up. I truly believe that. I believe there are some terrorists running around our country too. Some of them will born and bred here. Some came on visas, and some just came the easy way over our southern border. So we have some of them, but I think the westernized Muslims are pretty content with what they got. Hope I'm right. So now going on, Ezekiel 38 verse 14 in today's lesson. Therefore, son of man, he's talking again to Ezekiel, prophesy and say unto God. Now he's telling him he's got to prophesy to these people. On Wednesday night we were covering it. Now he's telling them what I want you to prophesy. Thus saith the Lord God, in that day when my people of Israel dwelleth safely, shalt thou not know it. Now going back to Ezekiel verses 8 and 9, which we covered last Wednesday, but we didn't include in the review. And verse 11 says this, after many days thou shalt be visited, in the latter years thou shalt come into the land that had brought back from the sword. So Israel had been scattered, hadn't been a nation for 2,000 years almost. And I don't know that anyone can name, I hear it bandied around, that there is no other country in the history of the world that ceased to exist and became a country again. I believe Israel is the only one. And that because it was prophetic. The word of the Lord said it would happen, and that was the vision of the dry bones. And whether just dead bones lying around, and prophet said, prophesy over those dead bones. And they came back to life. Flesh went on them. And that was a prophecy about the resurrection of the nation of Israel, that had ceased to exist, it had died. And so now he's prophesying to a bunch of people in Ezekiel's day. I think I should have wrote this down, I think I read Ezekiel was about 3,000 years ago. So about 3,000 years ago, if that's accurate, it's somewhere between 2,500 and 3 if it isn't 3. Because Jesus is 2,000 years ago. So you back up, and there were 400 silent years between the Old and New Testament. That's 2,400 years. So it's got to be more than that when Ezekiel was prophesying, and I believe 3,000 was the figure I read. And so somebody way back then was prophesying to these ancient inhabitants in these modern day countries today. Those countries had other names, but those land masses that formed those countries were being prophesied to about 3,000 years ago. And here's what Ezekiel is telling them. After many days thou shalt be visited, the people that inhabit these land masses today. In the latter years, when's it going to happen? A fancy way of saying in the last days. In the latter years, not in the future, but in the latter years. The years getting to the end of the way things are going. In the latter years, that means years as we know them has to come to an end. And this prophet is being told toward the end of those years as we know them. Thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, that being Israel, gathered out of many people. All these Jews around the world didn't have any place to call home. Against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste, but is brought forth out of the nation, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. And we'll get into something here in a moment. Thou shalt ascend and come like a storm. All these nations, Russia and all of her allies, shall descend and come like a storm. Thou shalt be like a cloud to cover the land, thou and all thy bands, and many people with thee. And thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages, and I will go to them that are at rest and dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. Now again, it would appear that Gog is a ruler in Russia. It could be a Russian premier, a Russian president, or perhaps the Russian general who will oversee this invasion. But whoever that is, they're coming to people that dwell safely. Now here's a comment I found on the internet from a website called BibleProphecyUpdate.com. concerning this idea of Israel dwelling safely. Now, some of the people. Somehow I got too many words in there. Some of the people say, well, Israel isn't dwelling safely, has never dwelled safely since it has become a nation. There's always been people that want to exterminate Israel. So they're not dwelling safely. They've already had 3 wars with the surrounding nations. So how can you say that they are dwelling safely? And then this prophetic website says, if you will look up the Hebrew word safely in your lexicon, where you find your Hebrew definitions in the back of a Strong's Concordance, for example, you will find that the word literally means confidently. Now, Israel, they may not be safe, but they're confident. They're defiant. Now, Word Study Dictionary said as a noun, it primarily means security or calm assurance. As an adjective, it means assurance or confidence. It is primarily a positive term to dwell in safety because of God's protection. So, Israel is confident. They're confident and they are cocky. Netanyahu doesn't appear to be afraid of anybody. And I'm not even sure he's a practicing Jew. He's a physical Jew. I'm not sure he's a religious Jew. That's what I mean by practicing Jew. I don't know if he goes to the synagogues or if he's like an American president, shows up in church for the show. You know, I don't know, have no idea what his personal belief system is. But I think down deep in Netanyahu's bones, he believes that he is the leader of the promised land, and God has a hedge on that land. God is going to protect that land, because he is cocky for the leader of an itty-bitty country. All right, in a good way. Now, Ezekiel 38 verses 15 and 16. And thou shalt come from thy place out of the north part. Russia's north of Israel. I should say parts of Russia. Part of Russia, eastern, parts of Russia are in Europe, which is north of the Middle East. And the larger part of Russia is in Asia. But he said here, thou shalt come. This is Ezekiel prophesying to these countries. Thou shalt come from thy place out of the north part, thou and many people with thee, all of them riding upon horses, a great company and a mighty army. Now what major military powers north of Israel? Russia. Who would the many people there be? Romania, Bulgaria, Bosnia, Kosovo, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Germany, and Armenia. These are some of the... we handed out a sheet who all these modern, all those ancient countries, their landmass is who they are today. And again, I'm hoping Iraq not involved. A lot of soldiers from America died in Iraq. And I can't see Germany involved. But then again, things change. Things change. But I see Germany, in my own mind, as one of the 10 European countries that the Antichrist will rule over in the renewed Roman Empire. But anyway, we'll see. But some or all these countries are going to join with Russia and attack Israel. With this massive army attacked Israel on horseback, and mentions horses here. I've heard teachers give modern day reasons why they believe this army will be on horseback, but I don't think so. Revelation 6. Beginning with verse 14, saying to the sixth angel which had the trumpet, loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. Flip that first page over. And the four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year, for to slay the third part of them. Now, third part of men. Now, this is not talking about the invasion of Israel. This is talking about the coming battle of Armageddon. When China rebels against the Antichrist. But there's a reason why I'm reading this. Verse 16. And by the way, I believe China will rebel against the Antichrist 1 hour, 1 day, 1 month, and 1 year ahead of the end of the tribulation period. In other words, a little over 13 months. 13 months, a day, and an hour. And the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000. And I heard the number of them. Now this is John here. This isn't Ezekiel. This is the book of Revelation. This is John's vision. I don't know if any of you know how much 200,000 is. 1,000 has 3 zeros. So you got 3 zeros and 3 zeros after 1. If you put them together, you got 6 zeros. Or after a 2, rather. What is a 2 followed by 6 zeros? 200 million. No. 1,000 times. 1,000 thousands. You got to have 9 zeros in 200 million. No, that'd be a billion. You got to have 8. Yeah, you got to have 8 zeros there. But this is prophesying an army of 200 million. There's only one country on the planet today that can put that kind of army out there, and that's China. Nobody else can build an army of 200 million people except China. All right? Now, and I saw the horses in a vision, and them that sat on them having breastplates of fire. Think of breastplates for a little bit in your mind as iron. And of jacinths and brimstone, and the heads of the horses were the heads of lions. Out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone. Now, do I believe there are some horses that are being ridden with lions' heads that breathe fire like dragons? No, I don't. I'll explain that in a minute. Verse 18. By these 3 was the third part of men killed by the fire and by the smoke and by the brimstone, which issued out of their mouths. For their power is in their mouth and in their tails, for their tails were like serpents, and had heads, and with them they do hurt. Now again, I want you to understand, God is showing a vision to somebody who lived about 3,000 years ago, about a future war. Well, this is John. He lived about 2,000 years ago. But the vision that Ezekiel had, he was showing modern day warfare to a man 2,000 years ago who wouldn't understand what he was seeing. And John, with a man who lived 2,000 years ago, God again was showing him modern day warfare, something he would have no comprehension what he was looking at. Planes, helicopters, tanks. So he knew people were riding them, they must be horses. And so both Ezekiel and John refer to these armies on horseback. Now, one of two things is possible. God either showed him these visions in a way that it appeared that there were armored horses who breathed fire because they could understand that because they understood horses, or he showed them what's actually going to happen, and they had to put it in words they could comprehend. One of the two was true. All right, now, a third of the men are going to be killed by this war. Now, I agree with most prophetic teachers who believe the army of 200 million to be Chinese, and China will revolt against the Antichrist 13 months plus 25 hours prior to the end of the tribulation period. The horses in the vision had heads like lions, tails like serpents with heads, and the horses could spew forth fire, smoke, and brimstone in their mouths. Will these horses really look like the picture presented in the prophecy? And of course not. God is, no, don't get me wrong, God could do that. But why would God do a miracle on China's horses? Of course not. God is showing a 1st century AD man, John, a modern day event. He showed John in pictures he could understand. He knew about horses, lions, and serpents. He didn't know about army strikers and grenade launchers and 50 caliber machine guns. And man, I did this back in 2011. The weaponry is even more dangerous today. And he didn't know about traditional tanks. He didn't know about the M67 flamethrower tank. These vehicles would certainly produce fire, smoke, and brimstone. So I gave you some pictures. In 8 years, these are probably all outdated. But they have a tank-like thing that can shoot fire a long distance. So it's as though out of its mouth comes fire and brimstone. They've got just the old modern-day tank that can go about anywhere it wants to. Then they got this one on the bottom. There's a driver, and it can haul up to, 8 soldiers. And the leader of those 8 soldiers and the driver. So it can haul about 10 people. And if you try to shoot those tires out, they're made of almost solid rubber. You're not going to do it. No air in them. And so that's modern-day weaponry. So you can read a little bit about that. But that's probably what John had in mind. Now, why did I say that when we're talking about Ezekiel? I want you to understand that Ezekiel's in the same problem John is, trying to understand what he's seeing in this vision. It doesn't add up to any reality he's familiar with. You know, when you and I step the first time into heaven, we're going to be confronted with this. What we see doesn't fit any scientific, industrial knowledge we have today. It's not going to be anything like planet Earth. And eventually God will move to planet Earth. In Revelation 20, New Jerusalem was set down, but it won't be in a conventional city. It'll be in a city that, I forget the exact number, I think it's 1,400 miles wide, one city. 1,400 miles long. How many of you know that's a big city? Here's the fun part. 1,400 miles high. That's out of space, folks. You couldn't live in that city today. They'd have to come up with some fancy science to pump oxygen from Earth all the way up 1,400 miles. This is going to be a supernatural city created for the redeemed. Outside of that city will be regular people, because God is going to continue to populate the earth after the 1,000 years. So it's going to be amazing. But what that city's like, you and I couldn't step into it today. And if God took us by a vision there, we couldn't explain it to anybody, because we wouldn't understand it. Paul said, I was caught up to the third heaven. It was not lawful that I speak of what I saw. And in the Greek, that could be interpreted, I got no words to tell you. Doesn't make sense to me what I saw. It was beyond my ability to comprehend. That's why I'm amazed when everybody falls asleep and dreams about heaven and said, God took me to heaven. They write a book about it. Isn't it amazing? You're smarter than Paul. Paul went to heaven, said, I got no words for you folks. And so what do the people who write books about heaven tell you? Oh, it's got beautiful flowers. We got beautiful flowers here. The truth is, we are not programmed to understand currently. We will be. Currently, we're not programmed to understand heaven. It's going to be something, I believe, multidimensional that we will have to change to live in. And we'll change when we see Jesus on the way up. We'll be like Him, for we shall see Him as He is. So I'm saying all that so you can understand these poor guys did the best they could, Ezekiel and John, to tell you about coming battles that was far above their pay grade. And then he says in verse Ezekiel 39, verses 1 and 2, real quick. I'm not going to get to all that, but that's all right. Oh, no, I'm on that third page, yeah. Ezekiel 39, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, thou son of man, prophesy against Gog, the same group here, and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I'm against thee, O Gog, chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. And, however, We already covered that on the other side in the Septuagint. It's Roth. Now, verse 2. This is what he's telling these armies he's prophesying against. I will turn thee back and leave but the sixth part of thee. That means 5 out of every 6 soldiers that invade Israel will die. I will leave but the sixth part of thee, and will cause thee to come up from the north parts, and will bring thee upon the mountains of Israel. Now, regarding the sixth part, I will strike thee with 6 plagues. Some people have in the margin. Some people who translated the Bible throughout the centuries, some had notes in their margins, and some are trying to figure out what this sixth mean, and they're not understanding the sixth part of thee. So they're thinking, well, it might mean 6 plagues, or draw thee back with a hook of 6 teeth, or and lead thee along. From the Septuagint and Vulgate. A verb meaning to drive, to drag along. It means to urge someone to provide impetus for moving on. It is used figuratively of God's moving God toward Israel and the destruction. That according to a study called Word Study Dictionary that I have in my computer. Strong said is to divide into 6. That Hebrew word means to divide into 6. And so the King James is probably accurate there. He's only going to leave a 6 to them. Now, some of the ideas above include 1/6. Why don't any of these scholars believe this to mean that God will only spare 1/6 of the invading country? The answer is they see that as a contradiction, because Ezekiel 38 and 39 seems to indicate that God will totally annihilate this army. More about this in verse 7. Or 6. All right, verse 6, and I will send a fire on Magog, and among them that dwell carelessly in the isles, and they shall know that I am the Lord. So, John Gill, commentator, said, well, Gog is in the land of Israel. He and his army perish there. His country shall be destroyed by fire, or by some judgment or judgments of God, which shall consume like fire. So, hurrying this up, some say, no, God's going to completely annihilate that army. Now, I don't know how you read things. If 5 out of every 6 soldiers die, I'd call that annihilation. I know if we sent 100,000 soldiers over to Iran, God forbid, and war broke out, and only 16,667 or whatever that 1/6 might be, survived, I guarantee you what the headlines would say. Trump sends soldiers to Iran and they are annihilated, leaving only 1/6 alive. So I have no problem with the idea that he annihilates them and there's still 1/6 of them still alive. But I do agree with the comment, God doesn't just punish the soldiers that go into Russia, He punishes the countries they came from. So however the 6th is added up, only 1 out of every 6 Muslims from those various countries and atheists from Russia, however many there are in the planet, only 1/6 is left after they invade Israel. What an amazing catastrophe of life that would be. And God said they're going to know that I'm God. His biggest, as you read these 2 chapters, the biggest thing God is interested in is Israel knowing He's God. Because they've become pretty loose in their practice of religion over in Israel. They're not even good Old Testament Jews. They're not offering animal sacrifices. If you don't believe Jesus has replaced animal sacrifices, then why aren't you still offering them? You were commanded to under Old Testament law. So they're not even good Old Testament Jews. Don't get me wrong, I believe there are a lot of Jews over there that love God, but they're not practicing Old Testament Judaism, which they should still be practicing if you don't believe the New Testament. So, anyway, in my opinion, it's only that the reason is because translators and commentators alike see a conflict between 1/6 spared and all being destroyed. Again, I'm not a student of Hebrew. My opinion is not based on the Hebrew structure of the verses involved. Rather, it's based on the various ideas of the commentators that I have had at my disposal. So, finally in Revelation 13, and I beheld another beast come up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. This is where God is showing John a revelation of the arrival of the Antichrist and his false prophet. The second beast, the other beast, is the false prophet. He had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon. Now, what are 2 horns meaning? In the book of Revelation, horns tend to mean kingdoms. The Antichrist has 10 horns, representing 10 countries behind him. The lamb, the false prophet, has 2 horns. What would they be? Israel and Judah. I believe him to be a Jew. A Jew who is as backslidden as you could possibly get ever. Nobody could ever be more backslidden from the religion than this Jew is. But listen to what it says about this false prophet that has 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. Verse 12, and he exercises all the power of the first beast before him, and causes the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. So his job is to get the world to worship the Antichrist. In verse 13, and he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. Now, I believe the false prophet will take credit for the victory, so he can deceive Israel. What victory? The victory in Ezekiel 38:9. I believe that this false prophet, that's why I don't believe. You know, a lot of prophetic teachers believe the destruction of those people who attacked Israel will be nuclear. It would really be a miracle. It's happened. It happened in Egypt, in the land of Goshen, when God protected the Jews. But God would really have to do a miracle to destroy the armies with nuclear weaponry and save the Jews. Because nukes don't favor one person over another. I believe this is just like a lot of Old Testament stories. God is going to supernaturally aim fire. The way he aimed fire and brimstone at Sodom and Gomorrah, he's going to aim fire out of heaven onto those visiting armies and destroy, I personally believe, 5/6 of them. Some would say all of them. The 1/6 is left in the other country. But however you see that. Well, fire comes out of heaven to destroy these. You know what starts the tribulation period? What starts the tribulation period is the 7-year treaty with Israel involved. What would ever get Israel to sign a treaty with Muslim countries? Well, because 5/6 of them have been destroyed. Number one, they're not as scary anymore. Not 5/6 of every Arab country, but of the most dangerous to Israel. 5/6 of them have been destroyed. But here's another reason. The false prophet's going to come along and claim he's the Messiah they're still looking for. He's going to speak like a lamb. He can emulate Christ, the Lamb of God. And he's going to call, said, I rescued you, behold, and he's going to call fire out of heaven. And they're going to see him perform a miracle that looks like the miracle that defeated their enemies. And he's going to say, you need to sign this treaty. And that's why they're going to sign it. And the treaty will be kept with the Antichrist for 3.5 years. And then he'll break it. So that's just some thoughts on coming things. And it's going to get interesting. I believe Ezekiel is before the rapture. John is after the rapture. The rapture is not what starts the 7-year tribulation. It isn't. The rapture doesn't start the 7-year tribulation. It precedes it. What starts it is the 7-year peace treaty. When Israel signs that treaty, deceived by the false prophet, 7 years of tribulation began. So I believe, personally, the church will be raptured right after this invasion by these countries into Israel, or right before. Don't really know. But either right before it, or if we're here and you pick up the paper and say Russia and her allies attacked Israel, I've got this advice for you, directly from the Scripture. Look up. Your redemption draws nigh.